Her worst fear was realized when the Duke caught her undressing, his gaze locked onto her scar, the very thing she'd hidden for years. But what followed wasn't disgust, it was understanding, and it would change her life forever. Hey, lovely, if you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Woman in the Shadows. Lady Evelena Westbrook had perfected the art of invisibility. At 28, she understood precisely where to stand in any ballroom to ensure she would be overlooked near architectural features that drew the eye upward, in the spaces between conversation clusters where gazes naturally slid past, always positioned so that her back remained toward a wall. Tonight, she had claimed her territory beside a marble pillar wreathed in winter greenery, close enough to the festivities to appear engaged, far enough to remain peripheral, forgettable. The Duke of Ashbourne's grand estate blazed with candlelight on this cold December evening in 1852. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across silk gowns and tailored evening coats. The ballroom hummed with aristocratic chatter, punctuated by bursts of laughter that never quite reached genuine warmth. Evelena observed it all with the detached interest of a naturalist studying specimens under glass. Her bronze silk gown had been chosen with meticulous care, the color chosen to neither attract nor repel attention, expensive enough to denote her standing as the daughter of a baronet, modest enough to signal she made no particular claims upon society's notice. The collar rose higher than current fashion demanded, fastened with tiny hooks that pressed uncomfortably against her throat. Multiple layers of fabric created a stiff bodice that allowed no glimpse of the skin beneath. Over everything, she wore a heavy Norwich shawl in deep burgundy, draped across her shoulders and pinned securely despite the ballroom's oppressive warmth. The heat was becoming unbearable. Evelena could feel perspiration gathering at her temples beneath the elaborate coiffure her maid had arranged that morning, but she dare not remove the shawl. She never removed the shawl. "Lady Evelena, how delightful to see you." Evelena turned to find Lady Hartwick bearing down upon her, ostrich feathers trembling in her elaborate headdress. They had been introduced no fewer than 5 times over the past 3 seasons. "Lady Hartwick," Evelena replied with a practiced smile. "Good evening." "Yes, quite." Lady Hartwick's gaze had already moved past her, scanning the room for more interesting prey. "You're looking well, miss. Westfield, was it?" "Westbrook," Evelena corrected gently, without inflection. "Thank you. You're very kind." Do excuse me. I've just spotted the Duchess of Thornbury." Lady Hartwick swept away without waiting for a response, having already forgotten Evelena existed. Once, such casual dismissals had stung. Now they were simply confirmation that her carefully constructed invisibility remained intact. Evelena watched Lady Hartwick's retreating form with neither bitterness nor satisfaction, merely acknowledgement. This was the life she had built, brick by careful brick, safe, controlled, alone. "She'll never remember your name, you know." Evelena glanced to her left, where Mrs. Dorothea Finch stood with a glass of lemonade in each hand. At 62, Mrs. Finch possessed the sharp eyes of a hunting hawk and the practical wisdom of a woman who had survived 6 decades of society's peculiar cruelties. She had served as Evelena's companion for the past 7 years, ever since her position as governess to the Ashford children had concluded. In that time, she had become something far more valuable than a chaperone. She had become the closest thing to family Evelena possessed. "I prefer it that way," Evelena said, accepting one of the glasses, though she had no intention of drinking. The cool crystal against her gloved palm provided an anchor, something to hold. Mrs. Finch's expression softened with understanding, but also with a thread of concern that Evelena had learned to recognize. "My dear, you're perspiring. This shawl in such heat—" "I'm perfectly comfortable," Evelena lied. "You're suffering." Mrs. Finch's tone remained gentle, but firm. "There's a difference between protecting yourself and punishing yourself." Before Evelena could formulate a response, her attention snagged on the fireplace at the far end of the ballroom. The flames leaped and twisted, throwing orange light across the polished floor. For a moment, just a fragment of a second, she wasn't standing in the Duke of Ashbourne's ballroom at all. Sarah's voice, screaming her name. "Miss Evelena, run!" The nursery ablaze, flames consuming the curtains, racing across the wooden floor with terrifying speed. 9-year-old Evelena, frozen in terror, clutching her doll. Sarah's arms around her, pulling her toward the door. The terrible cracking sound. The beam falling from the ceiling, massive and burning, catching Sarah across the back. Sarah's body covering hers, protecting her even as the fire found them both. The smell of burning fabric, burning hair, burning skin. The weight of the beam across Evelena's left shoulder and back, impossibly heavy, impossibly hot. Pain beyond anything she could have imagined. Her own screaming. Then darkness. Evelena blinked, forcing herself back to the present. Her breathing had quickened, her grip on the glass tight enough to make her fingers ache. Mrs. Finch's hand appeared on her arm, steadying without drawing attention. "Breathe, my dear," Mrs. Finch murmured. "You're here. You're safe." The memories were never complete. 19 years had passed since that December night, but Evelena's mind still protected her by offering only fragments, flashes of fire and pain, and Sarah's final act of love. Sarah, who had died shielding her. Sarah, whose sacrifice had left Evelena alive but marked forever. The aftermath had been, in some ways, worse than the fire itself. 3 months of recovery. The surgeon's pronouncements delivered to her parents while she lay in her sickbed. The scarring would be permanent, extensive across her left shoulder blade, upper back, and shoulder. Rippled tissue, pink and raised, that would fade somewhat with time but never disappear. She remembered her mother's face when the bandages were finally removed. The tears. The way her mother had looked at her, really looked at her, and then turned away. Those tears had not been relief at Evelena's survival. They had been mourning for the daughter she had lost, the daughter who might have made a good marriage, who might have been beautiful, who might have had value. Her father had said nothing at all. His silence had been its own verdict. At 15, Evelena had been standing in the hallway outside her mother's sitting room, about to enter, when she heard her mother's voice through the partially open door. "We cannot expect anyone to overlook such a disfigurement, Margaret. We've resigned ourselves to it. Evelena will remain with us, of course. We'll ensure she's comfortable. But as for marriage..." Her mother's sigh had been heavy with acceptance. "We've put aside those hopes." Evelena had quietly retreated down the hallway, her mother's words settling into her bones like truth. And perhaps they were. Perhaps it was better to accept reality than to harbor impossible dreams. So she had built a different life. She read voraciously philosophy, history, poetry, sciences. She involved herself in charitable work, visiting the sick, organizing clothing drives for the poor. She perfected the art of being present without being seen, of moving through society without disturbing its surface. It wasn't happiness, precisely, but it was safety. It was a life she could control. The ballroom's heat pressed against her like a physical weight. Evelena's vision swam slightly at the edges, her high collar constricting her breathing. She needed air, she needed space. She needed to escape this crush of bodies and noise and performative gaiety. Her gaze swept the room once more, cataloguing exits and opportunities. That was when she saw him. The Duke of Ashbourne stood among a cluster of gentlemen near the French doors leading to the terrace. Tall, perhaps 6 feet or more, with dark hair silvering slightly at the temples, a strong jaw, and an expression of profound detachment. He was, Evelena estimated, 37, or perhaps 38, handsome in the way of classical sculpture, perfect features that somehow conveyed no warmth. He was nodding at something Lord Pembridge was saying, but his eyes held no real engagement. Evelena recognized that expression. She had perfected its mirror image, the appearance of participation while remaining fundamentally absent. He was performing the role of host, of duke, of eligible bachelor, but the man beneath the performance was somewhere else entirely. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. The duke's gaze was startling in its intensity, dark eyes that seemed to actually see, rather than simply look. For a moment, Evelena felt utterly exposed, as though those eyes could penetrate the layers of bronze silk and Norwich wool and perceive the secret she carried beneath. Her breath caught, her heart stuttered in her chest. She looked away quickly, heat flooding her face that had nothing to do with the oppressive warmth of the ballroom. "Evelena?" Mrs. Finch's voice carried concern. "You've gone quite pale." "I need a moment," Evelena managed. "The heat." "Of course." Mrs. Finch's hand squeezed her arm gently. "The drawing room, perhaps. I noticed it earlier, just past the main staircase. It appeared blessedly empty." Evelena nodded, not trusting her voice. She could still feel the Duke's gaze on her, though she refused to look in his direction again. Her skin prickled with awareness, with the uncomfortable sensation of being noticed after years of deliberate obscurity. "I'll only be a few minutes," she told Mrs. Finch. "Take your time, my dear. I'll be here when you're ready to return." Evelina moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to navigating without being noticed. She kept close to the walls, her expression pleasantly neutral, her pace unhurried despite her desperation for solitude. Past the main staircase with its garland-draped banister, down a quieter corridor where the sounds of the ball became muffled and distant. The drawing-room door was partially ajar, warm light spilling into the hallway. Evelina paused at the threshold, listening. No voices, no footsteps. Blessed silence. She slipped inside and closed the door behind her with a soft click that felt like a declaration of freedom. The room was smaller than the grand ballroom, but infinitely more welcoming. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across burgundy wallpaper and comfortable furniture. 2 lamps provided gentle illumination. The air here was warm but not oppressive, scented with wood smoke and the faint fragrance of winter roses arranged on a side table. Evelina moved toward the fire as though drawn by invisible strings. The heat beckoned with its promise of relief, of a different kind of warmth than the suffocating press of bodies in the ballroom. She could breathe here. She could exist without performance, without the constant vigilance required to maintain her invisibility. Her hands rose to the clasp at her collar, her fingers already working the tiny hooks free. The release of pressure against her throat felt like absolution. She drew in a deep breath, then another, feeling the blessed coolness of air against skin that had been confined for hours. The shawl would have to come next. Just for a moment, just long enough to cool down, to remember what it felt like to exist without armor. Evelina's fingers found the pin securing the Norwich shawl to her bodice. She hesitated, old habits warring with desperate need. But she was alone. The door was closed. No one would enter. No one would see. She unfastened the pin and let the heavy shawl slide from her shoulders. Chapter 2. The Moment of Exposure. The shawl pooled on the floor at Evelina's feet like a discarded skin. For a moment, she simply stood there, feeling the cool air against her throat and shoulders, the blessed relief of being unburdened. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth gentler here, less oppressive than the suffocating heat of the ballroom. Through the closed door, the strains of a waltz filtered faintly, muffled and distant another world entirely. Evelina's fingers trembled as they moved to the fastenings of her outer bodice. This was madness, surely. Even alone, the ingrained habits of 19 years screamed their warnings. But her skin felt feverish, her breath still constricted, and the desperate need for relief overrode caution. She loosened the stiff outer layer, letting it slip down her arms. Beneath, her chemise and corset still covered her. She remained decent by any measure, but exposed in a way she never permitted. The scarred tissue across her left shoulder blade and upper back, usually pressed beneath layers of fabric, now met the air. Even through the thin linen of her chemise, she could feel the difference. The firelight caught the rippled texture of the scarring, visible through the delicate fabric. Raised, uneven skin that had been pink and angry for years after the fire, now faded to a pale pink-white against her complexion, but still unmistakably present. The scar stretched from her left shoulder blade across her upper back, and shoulder roughly the size and shape of the burning beam that had pinned her all those years ago. Evelina lifted her hands to her elaborately pinned hair, extracting pins until the dark mass tumbled loose around her shoulders. She gathered it in both hands and lifted it off her neck, tilting her head back and closing her eyes. The relief was exquisite. The simple act of existing without armor, without the constant vigilance of concealment. This is the woman no one sees, she thought. This body I carry in secret, this truth I've hidden for 19 years. For just this moment, she could stop pretending the scar didn't exist. She could acknowledge the permanent alteration of her flesh, the way her body told a story she'd never been permitted to speak aloud. In this quiet room, with only firelight as witness, she could simply be Evelina Westbrook, scarred and surviving, without apology or explanation. The door opened with barely a whisper of sound. Evelina, lost in her moment of stolen freedom, didn't hear it immediately, didn't register the change in the room's atmosphere, the presence of another person, until, a sharp intake of breath, her eyes flew open. She whirled around, her hair falling from her hands, her heart lurching violently in her chest. The Duke of Ashbourne stood in the doorway, frozen mid-step. His dark eyes were fixed on her, or rather, on what he could see of her exposed back before she turned. On the scarring that firelight had illuminated so clearly. Time stopped. Evelina's mind went blank with horror. Her hands scrambled uselessly, trying to pull her loosened bodice back into place, trying to cover what had already been seen. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. This couldn't be happening. This was her nightmare made manifest, discovered, exposed, seen. "Forgive me, Lady Evelina." The Duke's voice was low, carefully controlled. "I noticed you were unwell as you left the ballroom. I wanted to ensure—" He stopped. His gaze hadn't moved from her face, but she could see him processing what he'd witnessed, recalibrating his words, his approach. His expression was unreadable, not the disgust she'd expected, not the pity she'd feared, but something else entirely, something that looked almost like arrested recognition. "I should leave," he said finally, but he didn't move toward the door. He stood there, tall and still, watching her with those penetrating dark eyes that had unsettled her in the ballroom. Evelina wanted to speak, to demand he leave, to apologize for the impropriety of being discovered in such a state. But her throat had closed around any possible words. She could only stand there, trembling, waiting for the inevitable, the awkward politeness, the careful retreat, the pretense that he hadn't seen what he'd so clearly seen. Instead, Alexander Hawke spoke quietly. "How long have you carried that alone?" The question unmanned her completely. Not what happened, not, "I'm so sorry," but recognition of the weight itself, of the burden of concealment that she'd borne in silence for 19 years. The burden no one had ever acknowledged because no one had ever known. Tears pressed hot against her eyes. Her hands clutched the loosened fabric of her bodice, but she found she couldn't look away from him, couldn't break the strange, unsettling connection of his gaze. Her voice broke. She tried again. "I can't. You need not answer." Alexander took a slow step into the room, his movements careful, deliberate, the approach of someone trying not to startle a wounded creature. "Forgive my presumption." He crossed to where her shawl lay pooled on the floor. Bending, he retrieved it with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with his size and evident strength. He approached her slowly, maintaining a respectful distance, and held out the shawl. "May I?" Evelina nodded, not trusting her voice. Alexander draped the heavy Norwich wool over her shoulders with exquisite care, never once touching her skin. He stepped back immediately, restoring the space between them. "I know something of bearing wounds in silence, Lady Evelina." His voice carried a weight of understanding that reached past her defenses. "Though mine leave no visible mark, they are no less present. The isolation of it, the carrying of pain that cannot be shared or spoken, I recognize that burden when I see it." Evelina stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile this gentle understanding with the cold, detached Duke she'd observed in the ballroom. This man before her spoke with the authority of someone who had lived with his own private grief. The weight of isolation was evident in his tone, in the shadows behind his eyes. "I failed to protect someone once," Alexander continued, his gaze distant for a moment, fixed on something Evelina couldn't see. "Someone I loved dearly. I know what it is to carry that failure written in memory, if not on skin. To move through the world performing normalcy while bearing the weight of what was lost." The vulnerability in his admission shocked her. This man, this Duke, this stranger, was offering her something profound. The recognition that pain took many forms, that her visible scar and his invisible wounds were perhaps not so different. "It was 19 years ago," Evelina managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should be past it by now." "Should?" Alexander's expression softened, something almost like warmth touching his features. "Who decreed the timeline for healing from trauma?" "Survival leaves marks, Lady Evelina. Time doesn't erase them. We only learn to carry them differently. You've carried yours with remarkable grace." The gentleness in his voice nearly broke her. In 19 years, no one had ever acknowledged her strength. They had seen only defect, disfigurement, damage. They had never once considered that surviving the fire, rebuilding a life in its aftermath, moving through society's cruelties with dignity, that these things might require extraordinary courage. "If you would trust me with your story someday, I would be honored," Alexander said. His voice remained low, careful. "But you owe me nothing, least of all your pain for my curiosity. I intruded upon your privacy. The fault is entirely mine." Evelina pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of her armor settling back into place. But something had shifted. This man had seen her secret, and he hadn't recoiled, hadn't offered empty platitudes, hadn't treated her as something broken and pitiable. He had seen her, and somehow his seeing hadn't destroyed her. The realization was too much, too overwhelming, too threatening to the careful walls she'd built around herself for nearly 2 decades. "I must," Evelina's voice shook. "Excuse me, Your Grace. I should return to Mrs. Finch." She moved toward the door, skirting around him, keeping distance between them. Her hands still trembled, her breath still came too quickly. But she had to escape this room, this moment, this man who had looked at her scars and seen something other than ruin. "Lady Evelina," she paused at the door, not turning back. "I will not speak of what I saw tonight," Alexander said. "You have my word. Your secret remains yours alone." Evelina nodded once, sharply, and fled. She hurried down the corridor, her footsteps quick and uneven, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Behind her, she left the drawing room, the fire, and the Duke of Ashbourne standing in the golden light. What she didn't see was Alexander bending to retrieve something from the floor, a ribbon that had fallen from her hair when she'd whirled around. He held it carefully, studying the simple silk as though it contained answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. For the first time in years, perhaps since his sister Elizabeth had died, he felt something pierce through the numb performance of duty that had become his life. He felt curiosity, interest, a desire to understand the woman who bore her wounds with such quiet dignity, who had built walls around herself so high that even her own pain remained hidden. He felt, quite simply, something other than emptiness. Alexander tucked the ribbon carefully into his waistcoat pocket and stood alone in the drawing room, listening to the distant music of the ball, thinking about scars both visible and invisible, and wondering what had just begun. Chapter 3. The Unexpected Pursuit. Evelina had not slept. She had lain awake through the small hours, staring at the ceiling of her modest bedroom, replaying the mortification of the previous evening in excruciating detail. The Duke's face when he'd seen her exposed back, the way the firelight had illuminated every ripple of scarred tissue, the impossible gentleness in his voice when he'd asked how long she'd carried her burden alone. By the time pale winter sunlight crept through her curtains, she felt hollowed out, brittle as old paper. Mrs. Finch arrived with the tea tray at 9:30, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she set it on the table beside Evelina's chair. Evelina had already dressed another high-necked gown, this one in dove grey, and arranged herself in the small sitting room with a book she had no hope of reading. "You look dreadful, my dear," Mrs. Finch said with characteristic bluntness, pouring tea into delicate porcelain cups. "I don't believe you slept at all." "I slept sufficiently," Evelina lied, accepting the cup without meeting her companion's gaze. Mrs. Finch settled into the chair opposite, her own tea cradled in weathered hands. "Something happened last night, beyond overheating, I think. It wasn't a question." Mrs. Finch had known Evelina too long, understood her too well, to be fooled by deflection. Evelina's hands tightened on her cup. "Nothing of consequence, Evelina." The gentle firmness in Mrs. Finch's voice, the tone that had comforted her through 7 years of companionship, nearly undid her. Evelina set down her tea before her trembling hands could betray her further. "The Duke of Ashbourne saw my scar," she said flatly. "I was in the drawing room, and he followed me. He saw." Mrs. Finch's expression shifted, but not with the shock or pity Evelina had expected. Instead, something knowing settled across her features. "And how did he respond?" "With kindness." The words tasted bitter, which somehow makes it worse. "Worse than cruelty?" "At least cruelty, I understand." Evelina rose, pacing to the window overlooking the narrow street. "Kindness feels like he's indulging me, humoring the damaged spinster. Or," Mrs. Finch said quietly, "perhaps he simply sees you as human." Evelina pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching a carriage rattle past below. "You don't understand." "Don't I?" Mrs. Finch's voice carried a weight that made Evelina turn. The older woman had set down her tea, her fingers moving to the high collar of her own gown. "My late husband, when he first saw the birthmark that covers my neck and chest, the mark I'd hidden from him during our courtship, do you know what he said?" Evelina shook her head mutely. "He called it beautiful." Mrs. Finch's smile was distant, tender with memory. "I thought he was lying, of course, being kind. But he took my face in his hands and said, 'Dorothea, This is part of you. How could I not find it beautiful? Being truly seen, my dear, is terrifying. But sometimes it's also the beginning of freedom. Before Evelina could formulate a response, a sharp knock sounded at the front door. She heard her maid's footsteps in the hallway, the murmur of voices. Then the girl appeared in the doorway. "A letter for you, miss, from the Duke of Ashbourne's household." The maid's eyes were wide with curiosity as she presented the sealed envelope on a small tray. Evelina's heart stuttered. She took the letter with fingers that felt numb, waiting until the maid withdrew before breaking the ducal seal. The handwriting was bold and precise, the words formal yet carrying an underlying warmth that made her pulse quicken. "Lady Evelina, I must apologize once more for my intrusion upon your privacy last evening. My concern for your welfare does not excuse the impropriety of following you to a private room. However, I find I cannot regret the conversation that followed, brief though it was. I have spent a decade performing the role of Duke while feeling nothing beneath the performance. Last night, speaking with you, I felt something real. I would like to pursue that rarity, if you'll allow it. Might I call upon you this afternoon? Not for propriety's sake, I have no intention of spreading gossip about what I witnessed, but because I find myself hoping to know you better, to understand the woman who bears her wounds with such quiet dignity. If you are willing to receive me, I could arrive at 4 o'clock. If you prefer not to see me again, I will respect that choice absolutely. Yours in hope, Alexander Hawke." Evelina read the letter twice, then a third time, her mind churning with confusion and something that felt dangerously like hope. He had signed his given name, not his title. He had confessed to feeling real in her presence. He had asked permission, rather than assumed welcome. "Well?" Mrs. Finch's voice was patient but expectant. "What does it say?" "He wants to call this afternoon." Evelina's voice sounded strange to her own ears. "He says he felt something real when speaking with me." "And what do you want, my dear?" "I want." Evelina trailed off, the truth too frightening to speak aloud. She wanted to refuse, to retreat to the safety of her carefully constructed invisibility, but she also wanted desperately, terrifyingly, to see him again, to understand why he had looked at her scars and seen strength instead of defect. "You can refuse, certainly," Mrs. Finch said, as though reading her thoughts. "Send back a polite decline and return to your life exactly as it was, or you can see what he wants. You've been invisible by choice, my dear, but perhaps it's time to choose differently." Evelina moved to her small writing desk, her hand trembling as she took up her pen. The words came slowly, cautiously. "Your Grace, you may call at 4 o'clock. E. Westbrook." She sealed it before she could reconsider and sent her maid to deliver it to the Duke's footman, who waited below. The hours until 4 o'clock stretched interminably. Evelina changed her gown twice, first into a green silk that seemed too bold, then into a rose-colored muslin that felt too frivolous. She settled finally on a deep blue wool with its familiar high collar and long sleeves, armored and appropriate. At precisely 4 o'clock, the knock came. The Duke of Ashbourne filled her small parlor with his presence, tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal coat and silver waistcoat, but with a warmth in his dark eyes that his formal appearance couldn't quite conceal. The room, already modest, seemed to shrink around him. "Lady Evelina," he bowed, "thank you for receiving me." "Your Grace." Evelina's curtsy felt stiff, awkward. "Please, sit." They arranged themselves in facing chairs, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Evelina's hands twisted in her lap. Alexander's posture was formal, but his gaze remained steady, patient. "I won't pretend I didn't see what I saw, Lady Evelina," he said finally, his directness startling. "I find that pretense helps no one, but I want you to know that what I saw doesn't diminish you in my eyes. If anything, the strength required to move through society as you do, carrying that burden of concealment, speaks to remarkable courage." Evelina's defenses rose like walls. "It's not courage, Your Grace. It's necessity. Society doesn't reward disfigurement with admiration. No, it doesn't." His expression remained gentle but unflinching. "Society is often cruel to what it doesn't understand, but I'm not asking as society. I'm asking as someone who recognizes pain when he sees it." "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. "Why would you want to recognize pain, to pursue it? I represent nothing but a reminder of suffering." "You represent survival," Alexander said quietly. "There's a difference." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped between his knees. My sister Elizabeth died when she was 16. I was 25. We were supposed to ride together that morning, but I chose to attend to estate business instead. Ledgers and tenant concerns seemed more important than spending time with my baby sister. His voice remained steady, but Evelina could hear the weight beneath it. She went riding alone. Her horse stumbled. She broke her neck in the fall. I told myself duty came first, but I was wrong. She died while I was reviewing accounts. I've spent 12 years telling myself that if I execute my duties flawlessly, I can somehow atone for that failure. But perfection in duty doesn't resurrect the dead, and it doesn't ease guilt. Evelina sat very still, hearing in his confession an echo of her own burden, the guilt of survival, the weight of carrying loss that could never be shared. I've isolated myself emotionally, Alexander continued. I perform my role, Duke, landowner, member of Parliament, without feeling it. I'm numb, Lady Evelina. I have been for years. Last night, seeing you, speaking with you, I felt something. Empathy, recognition, a crack in the numbness. I wanted to pursue that, to understand it. Why would you want to pursue pain? She whispered again, but with less conviction. Because pain means feeling something, Alexander said, and I would rather feel pain than feel nothing at all. The truth of it settled between them, honest and raw. Evelina found her own truth rising to meet it. There was a fire, she said slowly. When I was 9, in the nursery, my nursemaid, Sarah, she tried to save me. A beam fell. It caught her across the back, and she fell on top of me, shielding me. But the beam... Evelina's hand moved unconsciously to her left shoulder. It was still burning. It pinned both of us. Sarah died. I survived with the marks you saw. Alexander listened without interruption, his attention complete and unwavering. 3 months of recovery, Evelina continued. Permanent scarring across my shoulder blade, upper back, and shoulder. My parents. They couldn't look at me the same way afterward. I became a problem to be managed, rather than a daughter to be loved. When she finished, silence filled the small parlor. Then Alexander spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you for trusting me with that. Not pity, not horror, just gratitude for her trust. He rose, and Evelina stood as well, uncertain of what came next. I have a private library, Alexander said. It's my sanctuary from the performance of being Duke. I share it with no one. I would like to share it with you, if you'd visit. Tomorrow afternoon, perhaps? Evelina should refuse, should retreat to safety, should protect herself from this man who seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed walls. Instead, she heard herself say, Yes, I'd like that. After Alexander left, Evelina stood at the window, watching his carriage disappear down the street. Mrs. Finch appeared beside her, silent for a long moment. That man sees you, Evelina, she said quietly. The question is whether you'll let yourself be seen. Evelina pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the cold seep through. Terror and hope warred in her chest, terror of being known, hope for something she'd never allowed herself to imagine. She realized, with startling clarity, that she wanted to try. Chapter 4. The Library and the Impossible Question. The Duke of Ashbourne's London townhouse was a study in understated elegance. Evelina followed a discreet butler through marble hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, her heart beating an erratic rhythm against her ribs. What was she doing here? What did she hope would happen? The butler paused before a set of double doors at the end of a quiet corridor. The library. Miss, His Grace is expecting you. The doors opened to reveal a sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, packed with volumes whose leather spines gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. 2 deep chairs flanked a fireplace where a modest fire crackled. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax, and something indefinably comforting the scent of a space loved and lived in. A reading desk stood near one window, scattered with books and papers that suggested recent use. Alexander rose from one of the chairs, and Evelina was struck again by how different he seemed here, less the formal Duke, more simply a man in his own space. Lady Evelina. His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes. Thank you for coming. Your Grace. She stepped inside, and the butler closed the doors softly behind her, leaving them properly alone, or as alone as propriety allowed, with servants nearby. No one else comes here, Alexander said, following her gaze as she took in the magnificent room. Not even the servants, unless I specifically request. It's the only place I can simply be Alexander, not the Duke. The vulnerability in that admission touched her. She moved to the nearest shelf, trailing her fingers along the spines. You have Marcus Aurelius and Plato, Seneca. You know them? Alexander's surprise was evident. I've had considerable time for reading, Evelina said, pulling out a volume of the Meditations. When one is largely alone, books become one's closest companions. Alexander's expression shifted recognition, perhaps sympathy. Then, we have that in common as well. They settled into the chairs by the fire, and what began as polite conversation about literature deepened into genuine discourse. Evelina found herself arguing philosophy with an ease she'd never experienced before. Alexander didn't merely listen, he engaged, challenged, delighted in her counter-arguments. You have power over your mind, not outside events, Alexander quoted, leaning forward with animation. Aurelius believed we could choose our responses regardless of circumstance. That's where true strength lies. But some outside events leave permanent marks, Evelina countered, her hand unconsciously moving to her shoulder. The Stoics didn't account for trauma that reshapes you. We don't always have power over how our bodies and minds respond to what's been done to them. Alexander considered this, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. So, you believe the Stoics were wrong? I believe they were incomplete. Evelina felt herself warming to the argument, forgetting her usual guardedness. They understood discipline and endurance, but not the weight of carrying wounds that don't heal. Not all battles are won through will alone. That, Alexander said quietly, is perhaps the wisest thing I've heard in years. He rose to pull another volume from the shelf poetry this time, Wordsworth, and as he read a passage about memory and loss, Evelina found herself relaxing into the conversation in a way she hadn't thought possible. Hours slipped past. A servant brought tea on a silver tray, setting it discreetly on the table between them, before disappearing like a ghost. The afternoon light shifted from bright to golden, shadows lengthening across the Turkish carpet. At some point, Alexander made a wry observation about Byron's dramatics, and Evelina laughed a genuine, surprised sound that burst from her before she could stop it. They both froze. I don't think I've heard you laugh before, Alexander said slowly. It's... He paused, seeming to weigh his words. It's lovely. Heat flooded Evelina's face. Her self-consciousness returned in a rush, and she looked away, fingers twisting in her lap. But Alexander had already moved on, returning to the shelves as though he hadn't just said something that made her heart stutter. Have you read Coleridge? I think you'd appreciate his philosophical poems. The moment passed, but something had shifted. Evelina realized with quiet astonishment that she'd spent an entire afternoon in conversation without once thinking about her scar, without the constant vigilance of concealment. She'd simply existed, been herself. This is the most I've spoken to anyone in years, she admitted as the light outside began to fade toward evening. Except Mrs. Finch, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be listened to, truly listened to, not merely tolerated. Alexander set down his teacup, his gaze steady on her face. I'd forgotten what it felt like to listen, to engage rather than perform. Most conversations in my life are transactions, political maneuvering, social obligation, duty. This is, he gestured between them, real. A comfortable silence settled over them, both staring at the fire. Evelina felt something dangerous blooming in her chest, hope, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. May I speak plainly about a practical matter? Alexander's voice was careful, almost cautious. Evelina's wariness returned, her spine straightening. Of course, Your Grace. I've been thinking about your circumstances and mine. Alexander stood, pacing to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. About the constraints society places on both of us, you because of your scar, me because of my title. I'm not sure I follow your point, Your Grace. He turned to face her, backlit by the dying light. You've been invisible by necessity. I've been isolated by duty. We're both performing versions of ourselves that leave us profoundly alone. Evelina's heart began to beat faster, sensing something momentous approaching. I'm proposing an alternative, Alexander said. For both of us. He crossed back to stand before her chair, but didn't sit. Instead, he paced, working through his words with visible care. A marriage, he said finally. Not a love match, a partnership of mutual benefit and respect. Evelina's breath caught. Surely she'd misheard. You would gain the protection of my title and name, Alexander continued, his words coming faster now. No one would dare slight the Duchess of Ashbourne. You would have financial security, independence from your parents. You would have a companion who understands isolation and asks nothing of you beyond companionship. He paused, meeting her stunned gaze. I would gain an intelligent partner to share my life with, someone who understands pain, someone to help me remember how to feel, how to engage with life beyond the performance of duty. This is... Evelina struggled to form words. You cannot be serious. I've never been more serious. Alexander's intensity was palpable. My terms would be these: no expectations of romantic love unless it develops naturally, no physical intimacy unless both desire it, separate bedrooms, but genuine partnership, honesty, companionship, mutual respect. You could marry anyone, Evelina managed, her voice shaking. Any woman in London would accept you. Why would you shackle yourself to a woman society considers damaged? Alexander's expression softened, but his words carried quiet steel. I don't consider you damaged, Evelina. I consider you extraordinary. And I'm not interested in anyone. I'm interested in you. His use of her Christian name sent a shock through her system, intimate, deliberate, crossing an invisible boundary. What about heirs? She asked desperately, grasping for objections. You need a son. The title. I have a cousin who can inherit, Alexander said calmly. If we decide we want children, that would be our choice together, not an obligation. What if you fall in love with someone else? The words tasted bitter on her tongue. I've had 12 years to fall in love, Alexander said. It hasn't happened. I don't expect it will. What if you regret this? What if I regret not asking? His voice carried the weight of someone who knew regret intimately. I've had enough regrets, Evelina. I don't want to add you to that list. Evelina stood abruptly, unable to remain still under the weight of his gaze. This is absurd. You don't know me. 2 conversations, and you think, I know you're intelligent, resilient, and kinder than you give yourself credit for. Alexander interrupted. I know you understand what it means to survive something that should have destroyed you. I know that in 2 conversations, you've made me feel more alive than I have in a decade. That's enough to build on. No. The word burst from her. I can't. This is too much. You're offering me a fantasy, and fantasies don't exist for women like me. What if it's not a fantasy? Alexander's persistence was respectful but unshakable. What if it's simply possible? Evelina backed toward the door, her hands trembling. I need to leave. Evelina, wait. No, she shook her head violently. This is impossible. You're asking for something I cannot give. Alexander didn't follow her, didn't press. He simply stood in the golden light of his library and said quietly, Take time. Think about it. But know this, I'm not offering you charity or pity. I'm offering partnership because I believe we could both have better lives together than we do alone, and I believe you deserve that choice. Evelina flared. She barely remembered the journey home, her mind a whirlwind of terror and longing, a marriage of partnership, protection, companionship, the impossible dream she'd buried 20 years ago, resurrected and offered with such devastating sincerity. Mrs. Finch was waiting in the sitting room when Evelina burst through the door. The older woman took one look at her face and set down her needlework. He proposed, didn't he? Mrs. Finch asked gently. Evelina nodded, tears streaming down her face now, all her composure shattered. And you said no. Another nod, this one more uncertain. Mrs. Finch sighed, crossing to gather Evelina into her arms. Then the question, my dear, is whether you said no because you don't want it or because you don't believe you deserve it. Evelina buried her face in Mrs. Finch's shoulder and wept for the life she'd never allowed herself to imagine, for the man who saw her scars and called her extraordinary, and for the terrifying possibility that she might actually deserve the choice he'd offered her. Chapter 5. The Decision and the Vow. 4 days. Evelina had given herself 4 days to wrestle with the impossible question Alexander had posed. On the morning of the 2nd day, Mrs. Finch found her at the breakfast table, surrounded by crumpled sheets of paper, attempted letters, all discarded. The older woman poured tea with steady hands and settled across from her. You're torturing yourself, my dear. I'm trying to think clearly. Evelina's voice was hoarse from lack of sleep. Thinking and feeling aren't the same thing. Mrs. Finch added sugar to her tea with deliberate care. What would you do with freedom, Evelina, if you weren't afraid? The question struck like a blow. Evelina stared at her companion, then down at her own trembling hands. I don't know, I've never had it. That's reason enough to try. By the third day, Evelina had drafted 7 letters to Alexander. 3 accepted his proposal, 4 refused it. None had been sent. She sat at her writing desk, forcing herself to articulate what she actually wanted beneath the layers of fear. Safety, yes, but also companionship, intellectual engagement, the possibility of being seen without shame, a life beyond the narrow corridor she'd constructed for herself. She wanted what Alexander had offered, but terror kept her from reaching for it. On the morning of the 4th day, clarity arrived with brutal simplicity. She needed to face her parents. Whatever decision she made, she needed to see them first, to understand what she was choosing to leave behind. The journey to her parents' estate took an hour by carriage. Evelina watched the London streets give way to countryside, her stomach churning with anxiety. The house appeared through bare winter trees, grey stone, perfectly symmetrical, as cold and formal as she remembered. A servant showed her to the drawing room where her mother sat embroidering by the window. Lady Westbrook looked up, surprise flickering across her elegant features before settling into her usual expression of vague disappointment. "Evelina, we weren't expecting you." "I apologize for arriving unannounced, Mother." Evelina remained standing, her hands clasped before her. "I have something to discuss with you and Father." "Your father is in his study. I'll have him summoned." Lady Westbrook set aside her embroidery with precise movements. "What is this about?" "I've received a marriage proposal." Her mother's expression shifted shock, then something that looked almost like pity. "Evelina, if someone has made you promises, who is it? Someone elderly? Or perhaps someone in financial distress?" The assumption stung, though Evelina had expected it. "The Duke of Ashbourne." The colour drained from her mother's face. "The Duke? But why would he—" She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air between them, heavy and cruel. Evelina's father entered then, summoned by a servant. Baron Westbrook was a tall man who had passed his height to his daughter, but none of his warmth. He had little warmth to spare. "What's this about Ashbourne?" he asked without preamble. "He's proposed marriage to Evelina." Lady Westbrook's voice carried disbelief. "To our Evelina." "Has he?" Her father's gaze swept over Evelina with the assessing eye of someone evaluating property. "Well, you must accept immediately, of course." "Edward," her mother's hand fluttered to her throat, "surely we should understand his motivations. Why would the Duke— Does it matter?" Her father's tone brooked no argument. "You'll never receive another offer, Evelina. Your mother and I had resigned ourselves to supporting you indefinitely. This is unexpected fortune. Secure the arrangement quickly before he reconsiders." Not once did either parent ask if she wanted the marriage, if she cared for the Duke, if he treated her kindly. They saw only the transaction, the unmarriageable daughter finally disposed of, the burden lifted from their shoulders. "I suppose he doesn't mind the scarring?" Her mother's voice carried a brittle edge. "Or perhaps he hasn't seen it yet. You must be careful, Evelina. You should be grateful he's willing to overlook such a defect." Something inside Evelina crystallized into fury, quiet, cold, and absolutely certain. "He's not overlooking anything." Her voice came out steady, stronger than she'd ever heard it. "He sees me completely, all of me. That's why I'll marry him." Her mother blinked, clearly confused by her daughter's tone. Her father merely nodded, already mentally moving past this conversation to more important matters. "Then it's settled," he said. "We'll make the announcement." "No." Evelina straightened her spine. "There will be no announcement. We'll marry quietly. I came only to inform you of my decision, not to seek your permission." She left before either could respond, walking out of the cold house where she'd grown up feeling like an unwelcome guest. As her carriage pulled away, Evelina knew with absolute certainty she would never return. Back in London, she went directly to her writing desk and composed a single sentence: "Yes." She sealed it and sent it to Alexander's residence before courage could desert her. His response arrived within the hour, delivered by a footman whose face betrayed nothing of his master's state of mind. But the letter itself, Evelina could feel Alexander's relief and joy in every carefully penned word. "Evelina, you've made me happier than I believed possible. Might I call on you tomorrow to discuss arrangements? I want this wedding to be everything you wish it to be. Yours, Alexander." When he arrived the following afternoon, his composure was impeccable, but Evelina could see the light in his dark eyes, the way his hands weren't quite steady as he took her hand in greeting. "You're certain?" he asked quietly, before they even sat down. "I'm terrified." Evelina admitted. But yes, I'm certain. They discussed the wedding with surprising ease. Both wanted something small, private, far from society's scrutinizing gaze. My private chapel, Alexander suggested. Stone walls, stained glass, room for perhaps 10 people. Would that suit you? Perfectly. Relief flooded through her. I don't want spectacle. I want something real, Alexander finished. As do I. Whatever you're comfortable with, Evelina. This is your wedding too. They settled on 2 weeks hence. Time enough for the banns to be read, for Evelina to pack her modest belongings, for Mrs. Finch to prepare for the move to Alexander's household. The 2 weeks passed in a blur. Evelina said goodbye to her rented townhouse, to the small life she'd built. Mrs. Finch supervised the packing with brisk efficiency, but Evelina caught her wiping tears more than once. You're not losing me, Evelina told her. You're coming with me. I know, my darling girl. Mrs. Finch embraced her tightly. These are happy tears. I'm watching you choose life instead of mere survival. It's beautiful to witness. The morning of the wedding, Evelina woke before dawn, her heart racing. By the time Mrs. Finch entered with breakfast, she was hyperventilating, unable to catch her breath. Breathe with me, my dear. Mrs. Finch's hands were steady on her shoulders, guiding her through slow inhales and exhales. That's it. In, out. You're safe. I can't do this, Evelina gasped. What if I'm making a terrible mistake? What if you're not? Mrs. Finch cupped her face gently. It's terrifying to choose happiness when you've been taught you don't deserve it. But you do, my darling girl. You do. The wedding dress had arrived 3 days prior, cream silk, with a high neckline Evelina had requested. But Alexander had added something. Delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, beautiful without exposing what she wasn't ready to reveal. The gesture had made her weep. Mrs. Finch dressed Evelina's hair with gentle hands, weaving cream ribbons through the dark strands. There, beautiful. Evelina stared at her reflection, barely recognizing the woman looking back. Not invisible anymore, not hiding, just present. The chapel was exactly as Alexander had described, small, intimate, with afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows that cast colored patterns across stone floors. Fewer than 10 people occupied the pews. Mrs. Finch, Alexander's cousin and heir, a quiet man who smiled kindly at her, the vicar, a handful of servants as witnesses. Alexander waited at the altar in formal black, his expression serious but warm. As Evelina walked toward him down the short aisle, their eyes met and held. You're here, he whispered when she reached him. I wasn't certain you'd come. Neither was I, Evelina admitted, her voice trembling. The vicar began the ceremony, his voice echoing off stone walls. The traditional words felt weighted with meaning beyond their familiar rhythm. When it came time for vows, Alexander spoke first. I promise to see you always, to honor your strength, and to build a life with you where neither of us must hide. Tears blurred Evelina's vision. When her turn came, her voice shook but didn't break. I promise to try to trust, to hope, and to believe that we can build something real together. I now pronounce you husband and wife. The permanence of those words settled over Evelina like a mantle, heavy, significant, irrevocable. She was married, to a duke, to a man who had seen her scars and chosen her anyway. You may kiss your bride. Alexander's hands were gentle as he cupped her face, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Evelina didn't pull away. She let him kiss her soft, respectful, but carrying an unexpected warmth that sent heat through her entire body. When they parted, both were slightly breathless. Alexander's eyes held wonder and perhaps surprise. This was supposed to be a practical arrangement, a partnership of convenience. But the spark between them suggested something more complicated, something neither had quite anticipated. As they left the chapel, Alexander offered his arm. Evelina took it, and the realization struck her with startling force. She was no longer Lady Evelina Westbrook, the scarred spinster who made herself invisible. She was the Duchess of Ashbourne. The question was whether she could grow into that title, or whether the weight of it would crush her before she learned to stand tall. Chapter 6. The First Test. 3 weeks of marriage had taught Evelina that partnership could exist without passion, that companionship could flourish in carefully maintained distance. She and Alexander had established routines that felt both comfortable and cautious, separate bedrooms, as promised, but shared breakfasts where they discussed the morning's newspapers, evenings in the library, reading in companionable silence or debating philosophy until the fire burned low. Afternoon walks through the winter gardens of his London townhouse, their conversation ranging from politics to poetry. A careful intimacy was building between them, not physical, not yet, but something deeper, something that made Evelina's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Alexander had been unfailingly patient. He never pressed her boundaries, never presumed upon their marriage in ways that would make her uncomfortable. He treated her with a respect that still surprised her, asking her opinions on household matters, seeking her counsel on estate business. Life, as the Duchess of Ashbourne, was both freeing and terrifying. She had power, now real power, that came with title and wealth. But power meant visibility, and visibility was everything she'd spent 19 years avoiding. "We've received an invitation to the Marchioness of Pemberton's ball," Alexander said over breakfast one morning, setting down his coffee with careful deliberation. "It's in 3 days." Evelina's hand stilled on her teacup. The Marchioness's winter ball was one of the season's most important events. Everyone who mattered in society would attend. "We can't avoid them forever," Alexander continued gently. "They'll talk more if we hide than if we face them. But the choice is yours, Evelina. I won't force you into something you're not ready for." Evelina looked at her husband across the breakfast table. In 3 weeks, she'd learned to read the subtle tells in his expression, the slight tension around his eyes that meant concern, the way his fingers drummed against his cup when he was thinking. "If I'm to be a duchess," she said quietly, "I should act like one." Alexander's expression softened with something that looked like pride. "We'll face them together." The morning of the ball, Evelina's anxiety manifested in restless pacing. Her new lady's maid, Mary, a kind young woman whom Alexander had specifically chosen for her gentle manner, helped her dress with patient hands. "His Grace had this made for you, Your Grace," Mary said, bringing forth a gown that made Evelina's breath catch. Deep sapphire silk that brought out the color of her eyes. But more importantly, a high back, beautifully designed, with intricate lace covering her shoulders and upper back, protected, armored, but undeniably elegant. When Evelina descended the stairs, Alexander was waiting in the entrance hall. He looked up, and the arrested expression on his face made her flush. "You're beautiful, Evelina." The compliment felt like a physical touch. Evelina's instinctive deflection rose automatically. "You don't need to say that." Alexander crossed to her, taking her gloved hand. "I don't say things I don't mean. You are beautiful. I hope someday you'll believe me." The carriage ride to the Marchioness's residence was silent. Evelina's hands twisted in her lap, despite her best efforts at composure. Alexander's presence beside her was steady, grounding. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The whispers began like rustling leaves, quiet but pervasive, impossible to ignore. "Is that the new Duchess? I heard the wedding was quite sudden. She must have some hidden fortune we don't know about. Or perhaps he needed a convenient wife who wouldn't expect too much." The speculation swirled around them. Evelina kept her expression serene, her spine straight, but she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes assessing, judging, finding her wanting. Alexander's hand settled at the small of her back, a gesture of support, of claiming. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured. The evening progressed with agonizing slowness. Evelina exchanged pleasantries with people whose names she barely remembered, whose false smiles barely concealed their curiosity. The cruelty was subtler than she'd expected, wrapped in polite phrases and concerned questions. When she excused herself to the ladies' retiring room, she hoped for a moment's respite. Instead, she walked into a viper's nest. Lady Thornbury stood at the center of a group of women, her elaborate coiffure trembling with ostrich feathers as she turned toward Evelina. The sharp-tongued matron's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Lady, forgive me, Your Grace." The title dripped with false sweetness. "How wonderful to see you risen to such heights. We had all quite given up on you marrying. The Duke must be very charitable." A younger woman beside her, Lady Blackwood, whom Evelina vaguely recognized as one of the season's reigning beauties, laughed delicately. "Or very desperate. I confess myself surprised by the match." Evelina's practiced composure held, but internally she felt herself bleeding. Years of invisibility had not prepared her for this, for being seen and found lacking in such a public, deliberate way. "I suppose some men prefer wives who won't complicate their lives with expectations," Lady Thornbury continued, examining her gloves with studied casualness. The implication was clear. Alexander had married her because she was undemanding, forgettable, grateful for any scrap of attention. Evelina met Lady Thornbury's gaze directly. "I suppose some women confuse cruelty with cleverness. If you'll excuse me." She left the retiring room with measured steps, refusing to flee despite the trembling in her hands. But she was shaken, the carefully constructed dignity threatening to crack. Back in the ballroom, she'd barely rejoined Alexander when Lady Thornbury approached them publicly. The dancing had paused between sets, and the timing was deliberate, maximum audience, maximum impact. "Your Grace," Lady Thornbury's voice carried across the sudden quiet. "You must tell us what convinced you to marry. We're all simply dying to know what changed your famous commitment to bachelorhood." The crowd's attention focused on them like a spotlight. Evelina felt hundreds of eyes, felt the weight of their judgment, their speculation about what a scarred, unremarkable woman could possibly offer to secure a duke. Alexander's expression didn't change, but when he spoke, his voice carried the cutting precision of a blade finding its mark. "Lady Thornbury, I married Lady Evelina, Duchess of Ashbourne, because I found in her what I'd never found in a decade of society's most eligible women: genuine intelligence, remarkable strength, and the courage to survive what would have destroyed lesser people. She is my equal in every way, and I consider myself extraordinarily fortunate that she accepted my proposal." The ballroom fell utterly silent. Alexander wasn't finished. "Anyone who disrespects my wife disrespects me directly. I trust I make myself clear." Lady Thornbury's face flushed crimson. "Your Grace, I meant no offense." "Evelina," Alexander turned to her, his expression softening. "Would you dance with me?" He led her onto the floor as the orchestra began a waltz. Around them, the crowd slowly resumed their conversations, but Evelina could feel their eyes still watching, reassessing. As they moved through the steps, Evelina whispered, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Alexander's voice was firm. "No one speaks to you that way, not while I'm standing beside you. They'll always wonder why you married me." Tears threatened despite her best efforts. "They'll always think I'm not good enough." "Let them wonder." Alexander's hand tightened on her waist. "I know why I married you. You know why I married you. Their opinions are irrelevant." The waltz became a turning point. As Alexander guided her through the turns, Evelina realized he'd meant every word of his vows. He truly saw her as his equal. He had just publicly claimed her, defended her, made clear to all of society that she was his choice, not his charity case, not his convenient arrangement, but his choice. The carriage ride home was silent until Evelina's composure finally shattered. Tears streamed down her face, and she couldn't stop them. "Evelina," Alexander's concern was immediate. "Did I overstep? I shouldn't have made such a scene. No one has ever defended me before." The words came out broken. "My parents were ashamed of me. They taught me to be invisible, to apologize for existing. And you claimed me in front of everyone." Alexander took her gloved hand in both of his. "I will always claim you, Evelina. You're mine, as I am yours. That's what marriage means." Something shifted in that moment. The careful distance they'd maintained, the practical arrangement they'd agreed to it, all felt suddenly insufficient for what was growing between them. That night, Evelina stood at her bedroom window, unable to sleep. Moonlight illuminated the winter gardens below, frost glittering on bare branches. She replayed the evening Alexander's defense, his public claiming of her, the way he'd looked at her when she'd descended the stairs. A soft knock sounded at her door. "Evelina?" Alexander's voice concerned. "I saw your light. Are you well?" She opened the door. Alexander stood in the hallway in his shirt sleeves and trousers, his cravat removed, looking more human than ducal. "I don't want to be alone tonight," Evelina said quietly. "Will you just stay? Just talk with me?" Alexander's expression softened. "Of course." He entered her private space for the first time, and they settled into chairs by her fireplace. They talked until dawn, crept through the windows about his sister Elizabeth, about Sarah the nursemaid, about the weight of carrying grief and the strange relief of sharing it. As the fire burned low and the sky lightened, Evelina realized that their marriage of convenience was becoming something neither had anticipated, something real, something deep, something that felt dangerously close to love. Chapter 7. The Unveiling of Hearts. The country estate in late January was a world transformed by snow. Evelina stood at the window of the morning room, watching white flakes drift past bare tree branches, blanketing the grounds in pristine silence. 6 weeks of marriage, and London felt like another lifetime. Here, at Alexander's country seat, they'd found a rhythm that felt almost like happiness. Morning rides through snow-dusted fields. Evelina had learned to ride with Alexander's patient teaching, discovering unexpected joy in the freedom of it. Afternoons in the library, debating everything from Enlightenment philosophy to agricultural reform. Evenings by the fire in the private sitting room that connected their separate bedrooms, talking until the logs burned to embers. Their arrangement remained unchanged, separate rooms, separate spaces, but the boundaries between them were blurring in ways neither had anticipated. Evelina could feel it in the way Alexander's gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the careful distance he maintained, as though afraid of overstepping, in the tension that hummed between them like a plucked string, growing tighter with each passing day. She was falling in love with him, had perhaps already fallen. The realization terrified her. What Evelina couldn't know was that Alexander lay awake most nights in his bedroom, staring at the door that connected to hers, aching with the weight of everything he couldn't say. He'd fallen in love with his wife. It hadn't been part of the plan. He'd proposed a practical arrangement, a partnership of mutual benefit. He'd meant every word about respect and companionship. But he hadn't anticipated this, the way his heart lifted when she laughed, the pride he felt watching her grow into her role as Duchess, the fierce protectiveness that surged through him when anyone dared slight her. He was terrified of pressuring her. Their agreement had been clear: no expectations of love, no demands of intimacy. To confess his feelings now would be to change the terms she'd accepted. It would be unfair, manipulative. So Alexander kept his distance and loved her in silence, grateful for whatever pieces of herself she chose to share. That evening, they sat in their shared sitting room, a comfortable space with 2 chairs by the fire, bookshelves lining the walls, a small writing desk by the window. Snow continued to fall outside, muffling the world beyond these walls. "I've been thinking about something," Alexander said, setting down the book he'd been pretending to read. "A project that could give meaning to." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My sister's death was meaningless. A random accident, a waste of a beautiful life. But perhaps I can create meaning from the guilt I carry." Evelina looked up from her own book, curiosity evident in her expression. "A sanctuary," Alexander continued, "for women who've suffered trauma, abuse, disfigurement, a place where they can heal, learn skills, rebuild their lives without judgment." He leaned forward, his intensity growing. "You've survived something that could have destroyed you. Together, we could help others who are suffering in silence." "I'm hardly qualified to help anyone," Evelina said immediately. "I've only just begun to help myself." "That's precisely why you're qualified." Alexander's gaze was steady on her face. "You understand what they're feeling. I can provide resources, funding, land, staff, but you can provide something far more valuable: understanding, hope that survival is possible." They discussed specifics for over an hour. A restored manor house on the estate grounds, staff trained to be gentle and patient, teaching women practical skills so they could eventually support themselves, a place of safety and dignity. Evelina's initial doubt slowly transformed into growing excitement. "Do you truly think I could do this?" "I don't think, I know." Alexander's voice carried absolute conviction. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, Evelina." The words hung between them, weighted with more than just the sanctuary project. The fire crackled. Snow whispered against the windows. "I need to tell you something," Alexander said quietly, "and I fear it may complicate our arrangement." Evelina's heart began to race. "What is it?" Alexander stood abruptly, pacing to the fire as though he couldn't remain still. "When I proposed our marriage, I meant every word about partnership and respect. I wasn't lying about my intentions, but I also wasn't prepared for—" He stopped, his hands clenched at his sides. "I wasn't prepared to fall in love with you." The word struck Evelina like a physical blow. She sat, frozen, unable to process what she'd just heard. "You don't have to say that," she managed. "Our arrangement." Alexander turned to face her, and the raw emotion in his expression stole her breath. "Damn our arrangement. I'm not saying this because I should. I'm saying it because it's true. I love you, Evelina. Your mind, your courage, your kindness. The way you laugh when you're surprised. The way you argue philosophy with me. The way you've begun to believe you might deserve happiness. All of it. I love all of it." "You can't." Evelina stood, her hands trembling. "You barely know me. I know you better than I've known anyone." Alexander took a step toward her, then stopped, maintaining distance. And I wake every morning grateful you chose me. Evelina's defense mechanisms rose automatically. But my scar, your scar is part of you. Alexander's voice dropped to quiet intensity. I don't love you despite it. I love you, which includes all of you. Why is that so difficult to believe? Because no one has ever... Evelina's voice broke. Tears blurred her vision. No one has ever loved me. Not my parents, not anyone. How can I believe... May I show you something? Alexander asked gently. He led her to the full-length mirror in the corner of the room, positioning himself behind her. In the reflection, Evelina saw herself as she always did, the high-necked gown hiding her shame, the careful arrangement of her hair, the woman who'd learned to make herself forgettable. What do you see when you look at yourself? Alexander asked. Someone damaged. The words came out bitter. Someone who should be grateful for charity. I'll tell you what I see. Alexander's hand settled lightly on her shoulders, careful, respectful. I see a woman who survived fire as a child, who lost someone trying to protect her and carried that guilt, who endured years of her parents' coldness and society's cruelty, who taught herself to become invisible because it was safer. His voice softened. And who, despite all of that, remained kind. Who reads philosophy and argues with me about Plato? Who learned to ride a horse at 28 because she wanted to try something that frightened her? Who is considering helping other women when she's barely begun to believe she deserves help herself? He met her eyes in the mirror. That's extraordinary, Evelina. You're extraordinary, and I love you. Evelina turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. I'm afraid I don't know how to be loved. I don't know how to trust this. Then we'll learn together. Alexander cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I don't need you to be certain. I just need you to be honest. Do you feel anything for me beyond respect? The truth rose in her throat, terrifying and liberating. I love you. I've been falling in love with you since that first night in the drawing room when you saw my scar and didn't flinch. But I'm terrified of believing in this. What if it's not real? What if you realize... Alexander kissed her, cutting off her fears with the gentleness of his lips. When he pulled back, his expression held wonder and joy and relief. Then believe in it anyway, he whispered. We'll be terrified together. Evelina made her decision. Will you help me? With what? Her voice shook but didn't break. I want you to see all of me. Not by accident this time, by choice. I want to stop hiding from you. Alexander's breath caught. Are you certain? No. Evelina's hands moved to the fastenings of her gown. But I trust you, and I want to try. Alexander helped her with trembling fingers, unfastening each hook with care, asking permission with his eyes at each step. The gown loosened, slipped down her arms. Underneath, her chemise and corset still covered her, but the scarred tissue of her left shoulder blade and upper back was visible through the thin fabric. May I? Alexander's hands hovered at the laces of her corset. Evelina nodded, unable to speak. When her scarred back was finally revealed in the firelight, the rippled skin across her shoulder blade and shoulder, pink-white against her pale complexion, the permanent reminder of the beam that had nearly killed her, Alexander was silent for so long that fear gripped her throat. Say something, she whispered. Alexander's fingertips traced the scarring with exquisite gentleness, following the pattern of the old burn. You've carried this in secret for 19 years. You don't have to anymore. I see it. I see you. And you're beautiful. It's not beautiful. It's proof you survived. Alexander turned her to face him, his hands still gentle on her shoulders. It's proof you're strong. It's part of your story. And I love every chapter. They came together then, not with urgency but with tenderness, two people who had survived their own private hells, finding in each other a place of safety and acceptance. Alexander laid Evelina down on the chaise by the fire, worshipping her scars with his touch, showing her without words that every part of her was precious to him. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath Alexander's discarded coat, the fire burning low, snow still falling beyond the windows. Evelina traced patterns on Alexander's chest, marveling at the intimacy of it, the casual nakedness, the complete lack of shame. I never thought I could have this, she said quietly. A life where I didn't have to hide. Alexander pressed a kiss to her hair. You never have to hide again. Not from me, not from anyone. They fell asleep there, wrapped in each other, and when morning light crept through the windows, Alexander woke first. He watched Evelina sleep, her scarred shoulder visible above the coat they'd used as a blanket, and felt his love for her expand until it filled every corner of his chest. When she stirred, he helped her dress with the same care he'd used to undress her, pressing kisses to each piece of revealed skin before covering it again. "Evelena," he said as she finished pinning her hair, "will you help me build the sanctuary? Will you take what you've survived and transform it into hope for others?" For the first time in her life, Evelena said yes without hesitation, doubt, or fear. "Yes, I'll help you. I want to." And in that moment, standing in the morning light with her husband, Evelena realized she was no longer the woman who hid in shadows. She was someone new, someone brave enough to be seen, strong enough to help others, and worthy enough to be loved. Chapter 8. The Legacy of Light. Early spring sunlight filtered through the windows of the restored manor house, casting patterns across polished wooden floors. Evelena Hawke, Duchess of Ashbourne, walked through the sanctuary she and Alexander had built, her hand resting lightly on her husband's arm. At 30 years old, she bore little resemblance to the woman who had hidden in shadows 2 years ago. Her bearing was confident, her gaze direct. The high-necked gowns remained, some habits died hard, but she wore them now as choice rather than necessity, fashion rather than armor. "The gardens are coming along beautifully," Alexander observed, gesturing toward the windows overlooking beds being prepared for spring planting. "Margaret has quite the talent for landscape design." "She does." Evelena smiled, warmth flooding her chest at the mention of one of their first residents. Who would have thought? The sanctuary sprawled across 5 acres of the Ashbourne estate, a restored Georgian manor house with 12 bedrooms, private cottages for residents who preferred solitude, workrooms equipped for teaching various trades, and gardens that would soon bloom with spring flowers. 2 years of planning, building, hoping. Evelena's mind drifted back through the 18 months since that winter morning when she'd first said yes to Alexander's vision. Spring and summer of 1853 had been consumed with planning. Hiring Mrs. Finch as matron, her dear companion, had embraced the role with characteristic pragmatism and warmth, finding teachers skilled in sewing, bookkeeping, writing, engaging a physician who would visit weekly without judgment, furnishing the space to feel like a home rather than an institution. The first residents had arrived in autumn 1853, 6 women, each carrying her own story of survival. Margaret, 22, burned in a factory fire that had killed 3 of her co-workers. The scarring covered her arms and neck, and when she'd first arrived, she'd kept her hands hidden in her sleeves, her gaze fixed on the floor. Evelena had seen herself in Margaret's shame and fear, in the way she apologized for existing. Anne, 35, bore scars from her husband's violence, cigarette burns on her arms, a slash across her cheek from a broken bottle. She flinched at sudden movements and couldn't sleep without a candle burning. Catherine, 19, had been born with a port wine stain covering half her face. Her family had kept her hidden, never allowing her to leave home, treating her existence as a shameful secret. Each woman had arrived frightened, resistant, convinced she was beyond help, and slowly, painfully, each had begun to heal. "Your Grace?" A voice pulled Evelena back to the present. She turned to find Margaret herself approaching, her burned arms visible beneath rolled sleeves, a sight that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. "Margaret," Evelena embraced the younger woman warmly, "I was just thinking about you. I wanted to show you the garden plans for the south beds." Margaret's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes. "I think we could do roses along the wall, and perhaps lavender in the herb garden." They discussed plantings for several minutes before Margaret said quietly, "May I tell you something, Your Grace?" "Of course. And please, when we're alone, call me Evelena." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "When I first came here, I thought my life was over. I'd lost my job, my friends had stopped visiting, and I couldn't look at myself in a mirror without wanting to die. You showed me it was just beginning." Evelena took Margaret's scarred hands in her own. "You did the work, Margaret. I only provided the space." "No." Margaret shook her head firmly. "You provided hope. You showed us that someone with scars can have a full life, can be loved, can be happy. When I see you with the Duke, when I see how he looks at you, it makes me believe that maybe someday someone might look at me that way too." From across the room, Alexander watched this exchange, his expression soft with love and pride. When Evelena caught his eye, he smiled, and her heart expanded with the familiar warmth of being truly seen, truly known, truly loved. That evening, in their private sitting room, no longer a space between separate bedrooms but a shared sanctuary within their shared life, Evelina and Alexander discussed the future. "We've received inquiries from 3 other estates," Alexander said, reviewing correspondence. "Lord Pemberton wants to fund a similar sanctuary in Yorkshire. The Duchess of Somerset is interested in creating one for women in London." Evelina leaned forward, excitement building. "We could create a network. Women across England could have safe places to heal, places where they're treated with dignity." "Then let's do it." Alexander set down the letters, his gaze intense on her face. "You've proven the model works. Now we expand it. I'll handle the funding and political navigation. You continue what you do best, giving women hope." Their partnership had evolved into something seamless. Evelina managed the sanctuary's daily operations, met with residents, supervised the staff. Alexander leveraged his title and connections to secure funding, navigate legal complexities, and protect the sanctuary from society's judgment. "There's something else," Alexander said carefully. "The fundraising event next week. Are you still willing to speak?" Evelina's stomach clenched with familiar fear. To speak publicly about the sanctuary meant speaking publicly about her own story, about the scar she'd hidden for 20 years. "What if I can't do it?" she whispered. "What if I freeze?" Alexander crossed to her, taking her hands. "Then I'll be standing right beside you. But you won't freeze. You've come too far." Mrs. Finch appeared in the doorway, her timing impeccable as always. "You've helped 12 women find their voices, my dear. Now use your own." The day of the garden party dawned clear and bright. Carriages began arriving at noon, bringing influential nobles, potential donors, members of parliament, and several residents who had chosen to attend. Evelina wore a gown of deep emerald silk, high-necked and elegant, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of the duchess she had become. But beneath the finery, her hands trembled. Alexander stood beside her as guests assembled on the lawn, his presence steady and grounding. Margaret, Anne, and Catherine sat in the front row, their faces encouraging. When the moment came, Evelina stepped forward to address the crowd of perhaps 100 people. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger with each word. "For 19 years, I hid a scar. I believed that if people saw it, they would see me as damaged, worthless, pitiable. I built my entire life around concealment." She described the fire briefly, 9 years old, her nursemaid Sarah's sacrifice, the beam that fell and left permanent marks, the years of isolation that followed. "I learned to make myself invisible. I believed invisibility was safety. But invisibility is also a kind of death. I was alive, but I wasn't living." Her gaze found Alexander in the crowd. "My husband saw me, truly saw me, and he didn't turn away. He showed me that being seen, truly seen, was not the end I feared. It was the beginning." She gestured to the sanctuary behind her. "Every woman here has a story of survival. They've been told they're broken, damaged, worthless. Society has taught them to hide, to apologize for existing. The sanctuary exists to tell them something different. You are valuable. You deserve dignity. Your scars do not define your worth." Evelina's hands moved to the shawl draped across her shoulders. This was the moment, the choice that would change everything. "I spent 19 years hiding this." She removed the shawl and turned, presenting her scarred back to the assembled crowd. The rippled tissue across her left shoulder blade and upper back was clearly visible through the sheer lace of her gown's back panel. Alexander had designed it specifically for this moment, giving her the choice to reveal or conceal. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Silence fell, heavy and complete. Evelina turned back to face them, her chin high. "This is part of my story. It's not my whole story. I am also the Duchess of Ashbourne. I am also a wife, a friend, a woman who has found purpose in helping others. I am also someone who has learned that survival is not something to hide, it's something to honor." Tears streamed down several faces in the audience. Margaret was openly weeping. "The women at this sanctuary are learning what I learned, that we are more than what happened to us. We are what we choose to become. I ask you to support them in that becoming." The applause began slowly, then swelled. But more important than the applause were the donations pledged immediately afterward. Lord Pemberton committed £5,000. The Duchess of Somerset offered to fund staff salaries for a year. An elderly duchess approached Evelina with tears streaming down her weathered face. "I had a daughter who was burned as a child. She died when she was 15. She couldn't bear to live with the scarring. If something like your sanctuary had existed then." Her voice broke. "Thank you for this. I'll fund an entire building, in my daughter's name." Evelena embraced the woman. Feeling the weight of it, her pain transformed into purpose, her story become hope for others. The fire that had nearly destroyed her was now saving lives. That evening, after the last guests departed, Evelena and Alexander walked through the sanctuary gardens as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. "I told myself for years that the fire ruined my life," Evelena said softly. "But if it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have understood the women who come here. I wouldn't have been able to help them." "Pain can destroy us or transform us," Alexander said. "You chose transformation. We chose it. Together." Evelena leaned into his side, feeling his arm wrap around her waist. "I've been thinking about the future, expanding the network, and perhaps," she paused, gathering courage, "perhaps children of our own someday." Alexander stopped walking, turning to face her with wonder in his eyes. "Truly, truly," Evelena smiled. "I think I'm finally ready to believe in that kind of future." "Do you remember what you said to me the night we met?" Alexander asked. "In the drawing room?" Evelena laughed. "I don't think I said anything. I ran away. Before that, you said, 'It was 19 years ago. I should be past it.' Do you still believe that?" Evelena considered, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "No, I don't think we get past trauma. We integrate it. We learn to carry it differently. The scar is still there, Alexander. It always will be. But it doesn't own you anymore." "No." Evelena turned to face him fully, her hands finding his. "I own my story now. All of it." They stood together watching the sunset over the sanctuary, over the gardens where Margaret would plant roses, over the manor house where 12 women were learning to live again, over the legacy they were building together. Evelena's mind drifted to a final truth. She'd spent 28 years believing her life was defined by one terrible night, one permanent mark. She'd been wrong. Her life was defined by her choices to trust Alexander, to accept love, to transform her pain into purpose. The scar remained, it always would, but it was no longer her shame. It was her story, and her story now included love, partnership, purpose, and hope. She was no longer the woman hiding in shadows, terrified of being seen. She was the Duchess of Ashbourne. She was Alexander's wife and partner. She was the founder of a sanctuary that would help countless women find their own paths from darkness to light. She was Evelena, seen, loved, and free. Alexander took her hand, and together they walked back toward the house as the first stars appeared in the deepening sky. Two people who had found wholeness, not despite their wounds, but through accepting them, honoring them, and transforming them into something beautiful. And so, Evelena's journey from shadow to light was complete. What began with shame and concealment transformed into purpose, love, and the courage to help others find their own healing. If Evelena's story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever felt the need to hide parts of yourself? Have you found your own Alexander, someone who saw you completely and loved you anyway? Or perhaps you're still searching for that courage to step into the light. Your story matters. Your scars, whether visible or invisible, are proof of your survival, not your shame. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption and love, please like this video and subscribe to Lyra's Romance Stories for more historical romances that celebrate emotional depth, authentic healing, and love that sees beyond society's judgments. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about characters who choose courage over comfort, love over fear, and purpose over pain. And if Evelena and Alexander's journey resonated with you, please share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are more than what happened to them. That survival is something to honor, not hide. Next time, we'll explore another romance, where two wounded souls find healing in the most unexpected places. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, you are not defined by your scars. You are defined by your choices. Choose to be seen. Choose to be loved. Choose to transform your pain into your greatest strength. This is Lyra, reminding you that the most beautiful love stories aren't about perfection, they're about acceptance, healing, and two people brave enough to build something real together. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.